This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and this is Chapter 4 of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. The Ramifications of the Astor Fortune. Astor flourished at that precise time when the traders and landowners, flushed with revenues, reached out for the creation and control of the highly important business of professionally dealing in money and of dictating personally and directly what the supply of the people's money should be. This signalized the next step in the aggrandizement of individual fortunes. The few who could center in themselves, by grace of government, the banking and manipulation of the people's money, and the restricting or inflating of money issues, were immediately vested with an extraordinary power. It was a sovereign power, at once coercive and proscriptive, and a mighty instrument for transferring the produce of the many to a small and exclusive coterie. Not merely over the labor of the whole working class did this gripping process extend, but it was severely felt by that large part of the landowning and trading class which was excluded from holding the same privileges. The banker became the master of the master. In that fierce, pervading, competitive strife, the banks were the final exploiters. Sparsely organized and wholly unprotected, the worker was in the complete power of the trader, manufacturer, and landowner. In turn, such of these divisions of the propertied class as were not themselves sharers in the ownerships of the banks were at the mercy of the banking institutions. At any time, upon some pretext or other, the banks could arbitrarily refuse the latter class credit or accommodation, or harass its victims in other ways equally as destructive. As business was largely done in expectations of payment, in other words on credit, as it is now, this was a serious, often a desperate blow to the lagging or embarrassed brothers in trade. Banks were virtually empowered by law to ruin or enrich any individual or set of individuals. As the banks were then founded and owned by men who were themselves traders or landholders, this power was crushingly used against competitors. Boy, the Mosaic Code, which outlawed usury, is looking better all the time. Come, Jesus, come. Armed with the strong power of law, the banks overawed the mercantile world, thrived on the industry, misfortune, or ruin of others, and swayed politics and elections. The bankmen loaned money to themselves at an absurdly low rate of interest. But for loans of money to all others, they demanded a high rate of interest, which, in periods of commercial distress, overwhelmed the borrowers. Nominally, banks were restricted to a certain standard rate of interest, but by various subterfuges they easily evaded these provisions and exacted usurious rates. Well, gee, that's why the Mosaic Code of the New Testament outlaws all usury. Doesn't matter what percent, it's all outlawed. Banks and their power. These, however, were far from being the worst features. The most innocent of their great privileges was that of playing fast and loose with the money confidingly entrusted to their care by a swarm of depositors who either worked for it or, for the matter of that, often stole it. Bankers, like pawnbrokers, ask no questions. The most remarkable of their vested powers was that of manufacturing money. The industrial manufacturer could not make goods unless he had the plant, the raw material, and the labor. But the banker, somewhat like the fabled alchemists, could transmute airy nothing into banknote money, and then, by law, force its acceptance. This is really, really interesting, folks, because Gustavus Myers is writing this book, this tome. He's writing it just a few years before the Federal Reserve hoax was perpetrated upon the American people. This is classic stuff here. Go, Gustavus. Let's go. Boy, you were right on it, because in a couple of years after you wrote this, the bankers really pulled a fast one, and they could print money out of nothing on an unprecedented volume. Back to the book. But let trader and landholder band in a company, incorporate, then persuade, wheedle, or bribe a certain entity called a legislature to grant them a certain bit of paper styled a charter, and lo, they were instantly transformed into money manufacturers. The lone trader or landholder, unsupported by a partnership with law, could not fabricate money until they did that. But the banker, they could print whatever they wanted. A mandate to pray. The simple mandate of law was sufficient authorization for them to prey upon the whole world outside of their charmed circle. With this scrap of paper, they could go forth on the highways of commerce and over the farms and drag in, by the devious, absorbent processes of the banking system, a great part of the wealth created by the actual producers. As it was with taxation, so it was with the burdens of this system. They fell largely upon the poor worker, whether in the shop or on the farm. When the businessman and the landowner were compelled to pay exorbitant rates of interest, they, but apparently, had to meet the demands. What these classes really did was to throw the whole of these extra impositions upon the working class in the form of increased prices for necessaries and merchandise, and in augmented rents. But how were these state or government authorizations, called charters, to be obtained? Did not the federal Constitution prohibit states from giving the right to banks to issue money? Were not private money factories specifically barred by that clause of the Constitution which declared that no state shall, quote, coin money, emit bills of credit, or make anything but gold or silver a tender in payment of debts, unquote. Again, this is fascinating that Gustavus Myers is writing this just a few years before the Federal Reserve conspiracy was formulated. Here again, the power of class domination of government came into compelling effect. The onward sweep of the trading class was not to be balked by such a trifling obstacle as a constitutional provision. At all times, when the Constitution has stood in the way of commercial aims, it has been abrogated. Not by repeal nor violent overthrow, but by the effective expedient of judicial interpretation. The trading class demanded state-created banks with power of issuing money. And, as the courts have invariably, in the long run, responded to the interests and decrees of the dominant class, a decision was quickly forthcoming in this case to the effect that, quote, bills of credit, unquote, were not meant to cover banknotes. This was a new and surprising construction. But judicial decision and precedent made it virtually law, and law a 1,000-fold more binding than any constitutional insertion. Courts and Constitution. The trading class had already learned the importance of the principle that, while it was essential to control law-making bodies, it was imperative to have as their auxiliary the bodies that interpreted law. To a large extent, the United States since then has lived not under legislative-made law, but under a purely separate and extraneous form of law, which has superseded the legislature product, namely court law. Although nowhere in the United States Constitution is there even the suggestion that courts shall make law, yet this past century and more, they have been gradually building up a formidable code of interpretations which substantially ranks as the most commanding kind of law. And these interpretations have, on the whole, consistently followed and kept pace with the changing interests of the dominant class, whether traders, slaveholders, or the present trusts, just like Fred Rodell wrote in the book, Woe to You Lawyers, the law is always for sale. This decision of the august courts opened the way for the greatest orgy of corruption and the most stupendous frauds. In New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and other states, a continuous rush to get bank charters ensued. Most of the legislatures were composed of men who, while perhaps not innately corrupt, were most easily seduced by the corrupt temptations held out by the traders. There was a deep-seated hostility in many parts of the country on the part of the middling tradesmen, the shopkeepers, and the petty merchants to any laws calculated to increase the power and the privileges of the superior traders and the landowners. Among the masses of workers, most of whom were, however, disenfranchised, any attempt to vest the rich with new privileges was received with the bitterest resentment. But the legislatures were approachable. Some members who were put there by the rich families needed only the word as to how they should vote, while others, representing both urban and rural communities, were swayed by bribes. By one means or another, the traders and landholders forced the various legislatures into doing what was wanted. Omitting the records of other states, a few salient facts as to what took place in New York State will suffice to give a clear idea of some of the methods of the trading class in pressing forward their conquests, in hurling aside every impediment, whether public opinion or law, and in creating new laws which satisfied their extending plans for a ramification of profit-producing interests. If forethought, an unswerving aim, and singleness of execution mean anything, then there was something sternly impressive in the way in which this rising capitalist class went forward to snatch what it sought, and what it believed to be indispensable to its plans. There was no hesitation, nor were there any scruples as to niceties of methods. The end in view was all that counted. So long as that was attained, the means used were considered paltry side issues. Here we go again. Situational ethics. The end justifies the means. The illumined ones in the world nowadays. The illumined ones in the world nowadays love that kind of Machiavellian outlook on life. And indeed, herein lies the great distinction of action between the world-old propertied classes and the contending proletariat. For whereas the one have always campaigned, irrespective of law, and particularly by bribery, intimidation, repression, and force, the working class has had to confine its movement strictly to the narrow range of laws which were expressly prepared against it, and the slightest violation of which has called forth the summary vengeance of a society ruled actually, if not theoretically, by the very propertied classes which set at defiance all law. The banking frauds begin. The chartered monopoly held by the traders who controlled the United States Bank was not accepted passively by others of the commercial class, who themselves wanted financial engines of the same character. The doctrine of states' rights served the purpose of these excluded capitalists as well as it did that of the slaveholders. The states began a course of reeling out bank charters. By 1799, New York City had one bank, the Bank of New York. This admixed the terrorism of trade and politics so overtly that presently an opposition application for a charter was made. This solitary bank was run by some of the old land-owning families who fully understood the danger involved in the triumph of the democratic ideas represented by Jefferson. A danger far overestimated, however, since when, as democratic principles did, the propertied class continued its victorious march for the simple reason that property was able to divert manhood's suffrage to its own account, and to aggrandize itself still further on the ruins of every substantial similar reform expedient. What the agitated masses, for the most part of that period, could not comprehend was that they who hold the possession of the economic resources will indubitably sway the politics of a country until such time as the proletariat, no longer divided but thoroughly conscious, organized, and aggressive, will avail itself of its majority vote to transfer the powers of government to itself. The Bank of New York injected itself virulently into politics and fought the spread of democratic ideas with sordid but effective weapons. If a merchant dared support what it denounced as heretical doctrines, the bank at once blacklisted him by rejecting his notes when he needed cash most. It was now that Aaron Burr, that adroit leader of the opposition party, stepped in. Seconded or instigated by certain traders, he set out to get one of those useful and invaluable bank charters for his backers. The explanation of how he accomplished the act is thus given. Taking advantage of the epidemic of yellow fever then desolating New York City, he, with much preliminary of philanthropic motives, introduced a bill for the apparent beneficent purpose of diminishing the future possibility of the disease by incorporating a company called the Manhattan Company to supply pure, wholesome water. Supposing that the charter granted nothing more than this, the explanation goes on, the legislature passed the bill, and was most painfully surprised and shocked when the fact came out that the measure had been so deftly drawn that it, in fact, granted an unlimited charter conferring banking powers on the company. This explanation is probably shallow and deficient. It is much more likely that bribery was resorted to, considering the fact that the granting of every successive bank charter was invariably accompanied by bribery. 6 years later, the Mercantile Bank received a charter for a 13 years period, a charter which, it was openly charged by certain members of the Assembly, was secured by bribery. These charges were substantially proved by the testimony before a legislative investigating committee. In 1811, the Mechanics' Bank was chartered with a time limit under circumstances indicating bribery. Indeed, so often was bribing done, and so pronounced were charges of corruption at frequent sessions of the legislature, that in 1812 the Assembly, in an heroic spasm of impressive virtue, passed a resolution compelling each member to pledge himself that he had neither taken nor would take, quote, any reward or profit, direct or indirect, for any vote on any measure, unquote. This resolution was palpably intended to blind the public, for in that identical year, the Bank of America received a charter amid charges of flagrant corruption. One assemblyman declared under oath that he had been offered the sum of $500, quote, besides a handsome present for his vote, unquote. All of the banks, except the Manhattan, had limited charters. Measures for the renewal of these were practically all put through by bribery. Thus, in 1818, the charter of the Merchants' Bank was renewed until 1832, and renewed after that. The chartering of the Chemical Bank, parenthesis, that staid and most eminently respectable and solid New York institution of today, end parenthesis, was accomplished by bribery. The Chemical Bank was an outgrowth of the Chemical Manufacturing Company, the plant and business of which were bought expressly as an excuse to get a banking auxiliary. The Golay brothers were among the founders of this bank. In fact, many of the great landed fortunes were inseparably associated with the frauds of the banking system. Money from land was used to bribe legislatures, and money made from the banks was employed in buying more land. The promoters of the Chemical Bank set aside a considerable sum of money and $50,000 in stock for the bribery fund. No sooner had it received its charter than it began to turn out reams of paper money based upon no value, which paper was paid as wages to its employees as well as circulated generally. So year after year, the bribery went on industriously without cessation. Wow, this is crucial history here, folks. Gustavus Myers is writing this, criticizing the banks and how they love to print paper money that's worthless. Gustavus Myers is writing this just a few years before the penultimate private bank that took over the entire American financial system and would print money based out of nothing, and to which insult upon injury the American public would owe interest to these bankers for all of this, for the paper and the ink. We would owe them for the privilege of their printing money out of nothing. And they would call it the Federal Reserve as the ultimate con job, arguably of all time. Gustavus Myers he's little did he know the biggest con job was coming. Bribery, a crime in name only. Were the bribers ever punished, their illicitly gotten charters declared forfeited, and themselves placed under the ban of virtuous society? Far, very far from it. The men who did the bribing were of the very pinnacle of social power, elegance, and position, or quickly leaped to that height by reason of their wealth. They were among the foremost landholders and traders of the day. By these, and a wide radius of similar means, they amassed wealth, or greatly increased wealth already accumulated. The ancestors of some of the most conspicuous multi-millionaire families of the present were deeply involved in the perpetration of all of those continuous frauds and crimes. Peter Golay and his sons, Peter P. and Robert, for instance, and Jacob Lorillard, who for many years was president of the Mechanics' Bank. No stigma attached to these wealth graspers. Their success as possessors of riches at once, by the automatic processes of a society which enthroned wealth, elevated them to be commanding personages in trade, politics, orthodoxy, and the highest social spheres. The cropped convict released from prison was followed everywhere by the jeers and branding of a society which gloated over his downfall and which forever reminded him of his infamy. But the men who waded on to wealth through the muck of base practices and by means of crimes a millionfold more insidious and dangerous than the offense of the convict, were not only honored as leading citizens, but they became the extolled and the unquestioned dictators of that supreme trading society which made modes, customs, and laws. There are probably 50 to 100 Bible verses that, if I took the time, would reference that, would warn of just what Gustavus Myers wrote about. Wow, this is fantastic reading. Why aren't high school students and college students reading Gustavus Myers in history class? I'll tell you why. I know why. If you haven't figured out why yet, just shut this off and turn the TV back on. Back to the book. It was a society essentially built upon money. Consequently, he who was dexterous enough to get possession of the spoils experienced no difficulty in establishing his place among the elect and anointed. His frauds were forgotten or ignored. Only the fact that he was a rich man was remembered. Go, Gustavus, you are so dead-on accurate. And yet, what is more natural than to seek and accept the obeisance lavished upon property in a scheme of society where property is crowned as the ruling power? In the rude centuries previously, mankind exalted physical prowess. He who had the greatest strength and wielded the deftest strokes became the victor of the judicial combat and gathered in laurels and property. But now we have arrived at the time when the cunning of mind supplants the cunning of muscle. Bribery takes the place of brawn, and we're still in that era, folks. The contestants fight with statutes instead of swords, and this newer plan, which some have decried as degenerate, is a great advance over the old, for thereby has brute force been legally abandoned, in personal quarrels at least, and that cunning of mind which has held sway is the first evidence of the reign of mind, which from a low order will universally develop noble and supereminent qualities charged with the good, and that alone of the human race. Astor's banking activities. With this preliminary sketch, we can now proceed to a consideration of how Astor profited from the banking system. We see that constantly the bold spirits of the trading class, with a part of the money made or plundered in some direction or other, were bribing representative bodies to give them exceptional rights and privileges, which, in turn, were made the fertile basis for further spoliation. Astor was a stockholder in at least 4 banks, the charters of which had been obtained or renewed by trickery and fraud, or both. He owned 1,000 shares of the capital stock of the Manhattan Company, 1,000 of the Merchants Bank, 500 of the Bank of America, 1,604 of the Mechanics Bank. He also owned, at one time, considerable stock in the National Bank, the charter of which it was strongly suspected had been obtained by bribery. There is no evidence that he himself did the actual bribing or was in any way concerned in it. In all of the legislative investigations following charges of bribery, the invariable practice was to throw the blame upon the wicked lobbyists, while professing the most naive astonishment that any imputations should be cast upon any of the members of the honorable legislature. As for the bribers behind the scenes, their names seldom or never were brought out or divulged. In brief, these investigations were all of that rose-water order generally termed, quote-unquote, whitewashing. They used to do that even then, huh, Gustavus? But whether Astor personally bribed or not, he, at any rate, consciously profited from the results of bribery. And, moreover, it is not probable that his methods in the East were different, except in form, from the debauching and exploitation that he made a system of in the fur regions. It is not outside the realm of reasonable conjecture to suppose that he either helped to debauch or connived at the corruption of legislatures, just as, in another way, he debauched the Indian tribes. Furthermore, his relations with Aaron Burr in one notorious transaction are sufficient to justify the conclusion that he held the closest business relations with that political adventurer who lived next door to him at number 221 Broadway. This transaction was one which was partially the outcome of the organization of the Manhattan Bank and was a source of millions of dollars of profit to Astor and his descendants. A century or more ago, Trinity Church owned 3 times the extent of even the vast real estate that it now holds. A considerable part of this was the gift of that royal Governor Fletcher, who, as has been set forth, was such a master hand at taking bribes. There long existed a contention upon the part of New York State, a contention embodied in numerous official records, that the land held for centuries by Trinity Church was usurped, that Trinity's title was invalid, and that the real title vested in the people of the city of New York. In 1854 and 1855, the land commissioners of New York State, deeply impressed by the facts as marshaled by Rutger B. Miller, recommended that the state bring suit. But with the filing of Trinity's reply, mysterious influences intervened, and the matter was dropped. These influences are frequently referred to in aldermanic documents. To go back, however, in 1767, Trinity Church leased to Abraham Mortier for 99 years at a total annual rental of $269 a year, a stretch of land comprising 465 lots in what is now the vicinity bounded by Greenwich, Spring, and Hudson Streets. Mortier used it as a country place until 1797, when the New York legislature, upon the initiative of Burr, developed a consuming curiosity as to how Trinity Church was expending its income. This was a very ticklish question with the pious vestrymen of Trinity, as it was generally suspected that they were commingling business and piety in a way that might, if known, cause them some trouble. The law, at that time, restricted the annual income of Trinity Church from its property to $12,000 a year. A committee of investigation was appointed. Of this committee, Burr was made chairman. Okay, this chapter, like the last chapter, is a bit longer than I was expecting, so we're going to take a few minutes break and be back in a few minutes. Okay, we're back, continuing with the history of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. This is Chapter 4 of Volume 2. How Astor Secured a Lease. Burr never really made any investigation. Why? The reason soon came out when Burr turned up with a transfer of the Mortier lease to himself. He at once obtained from the Manhattan Bank a $38,000 loan pledging the lease as security. When his duel with Hamilton forced Burr to flee the country, Astor promptly came along and took the lease off his hands. Astor, it was said, paid him $32,000 for it, subject to the Manhattan Bank's mortgage. At any rate, Astor now held this extraordinarily valuable lease. He immediately released it in lots, and as the city fast grew, covering the whole stretch with population and buildings, the lease was a source of great revenue to him and to his heirs. As a Lutheran, Astor could not be a vestryman of Trinity Church. Anthony Lespenard, however, it may be passingly noted, was a vestryman, and as such mixed piety and business so well that his heirs became possessed of millions of dollars by the mere fact that in 1779, when a vestryman, he got a lease for 83 years of 81 Trinity lots adjacent to the Astor leased land. at a total annual rental of $177.50. It was by the aid of the banking system that the trading class was greatly enabled to manipulate the existing and potential resources of the country, and to extend invaluable favors to themselves. In this system, Astor was a chief participant. For many years, the banks, especially in New York State, were empowered by law to issue paper money to the extent of 3 times the amount of their capital. The actual specie was seized hold of by the shippers and either hoarded or exported in quantities to Asia or Europe, which, of course, would not handle paper money. By 1819, the banks in New York had issued $12,500,000, and the total amount of specie to redeem this fiat stuff amounted to only $2 million. These banknotes were nothing more or less than irresponsible promises to pay. What became of them? This is so fascinating. Gustavus Myers is writing denigratingly about paper money, fiat money, which are, he says, nothing more than irresponsible promises to pay. He's writing all this just a few short years before the biggest scandalous rip-off institution of paper money ever was produced, the Federal Reserve. That, as almost everybody with 3/4 of a brain or more knows, the Federal Reserve occurred in 1913. That swindle was perpetrated in 1913 upon the American public, and Gustavus Myers is writing this just a few years before that, in the early 1900s. What the worker got as wages. What indeed became of them? They were imposed upon the working class as payment for labor. Although these banknotes were subject to constant depreciation, the worker had to accept them as though they were full value. But when the worker went to buy provisions or pay rent, he was compelled to pay 1/3 and often 1/2 as much as the value represented by those banknotes. Sometimes, in crises, he could not get them cashed at all. They became pitiful souvenirs in his hands. Wow! This fact was faintly recognized by a New York Senate committee when it reported in 1819 that every artifice in the wit of man had been devised to find ways of putting these notes into circulation. Every artifice except for the Federal Reserve. They wouldn't invent that for almost a century later. That when the merchant got this depreciated paper, he, quote, saddled it upon the departments of productive labor, unquote. The report went on, quote, the farmer and the mechanic alike have been invited to make loans and have fallen victims to the avarice of the banker. The result has been the banishment of metallic currency, the loss of commercial confidence, fictitious capital, increase of civil prosecutions, and multiplication of crimes, which is why the Mosaic Code in the Bible demands that people stick to silver and gold. What the committee did not see was that by this process, those in control of the banks had, with no expenditure, possessed themselves of a considerable part of the resources of the country and had made the worker yield up 2 and 3 times as much of the produce of his labor as he had to give before the system was started. This is why the Bible outlaws, in the Mosaic Code, it outlaws paper money, outlaws usury. This is exactly why. The large amount of paper money without any basis of value whatever was put out at a heavy rate of interest. You see? Usury. Here we go. When the merchant paid his interest, he charged it up as an extra cost on his wares. And when the worker came to buy these same wares, which he or some fellow worker had made, he was charged a high price, which included 3 things all thrown upon him: rent, interest, and profit. The banks indirectly sucked in a large portion of these 3 factors. And so thoroughly did the banks control legislation that they were not content with the power of issuing spurious paper money. They demanded and got through an act exempting bank stock from taxation. Thus, year after year, this system went on, beggaring great numbers of people, enriching the owners of the bank. Oh, I wish I could read what Gustavus had to say after the Federal Reserve was pushed through a few years later, after he wrote this, and virtually giving the banks a life and death power over the worker, the farmer, and the floundering, struggling small businessman alike. After the Federal Reserve, they would have life and death power over those. The laws were but slightly altered. Quote, "The great profits of the banks," unquote, reported a New York State Committee on Banks and Insurance in 1834, quote, "arise from their issues. It is this privilege which enables them, in fact, to coin money, to substitute their evidences of debt for a metallic currency, and to loan more than their actual capitals. A bank of $100,000 capital is permitted to loan $250,000 and thus receive an interest on 2.5 the amount actually invested," unquote. The Working Men's Party protest. It cannot be said that all of the working men were apathetic, or that some did not see through the fraud of the system. They had good reason for the deepest indignation and exasperation. The terrible injustices piled upon them from every quarter, the low wages that they were forced to accept, often in depreciated or worthless banknotes, the continually increasing exactions of the landlords, the high prices squeezed out of them by monopolies. This all sounds like today, only it's worse today. The arbitrary discriminations of law. Yeah, these were not without their effect. The Working Men's Party, formed in 1829 in New York City, was the first and most ominous of these proletarian uprisings. You'd never get the proletarians uprising in America anymore. Not with television and cell phones and video games and fluoride consumption. Anyway, the Working Men's Party, its resolutions read like a proletarian declaration of independence and would unquestionably have resulted in the most momentous agitation had it not been that it was smothered by its leaders, and also because the slavery issue long obscured purely economic questions. Quote-unquote resolved ran its resolutions, adopted at Military Hall, October 19, 1829, quote, "In the opinion of this meeting, that the first appropriation of the soil of the state to private and exclusive possession was eminently and barbarously unjust, that it was substantially feudal in its character, inasmuch as those who received enormous and unequal possessions were lords, and those who received little or nothing were vassals." Oh man, this is why God put in the Jubilee year every 50 years. But America's a Christian nation, right? We don't need a Jubilee year. We've got the Babylonian laws to protect the super rich. No, we just let them continually keep accumulating their riches. We are not a Christian country. We never were. That hereditary transmission of wealth on the one hand and poverty on the other has brought down to the present generation all the evils of the feudal system, and that, in our opinion, is the prime source of all our calamities, unquote. Yeah, they were getting it. After declaring that the Working Men's Party would oppose all exclusive privileges, monopolies, and exemptions, the resolutions proceeded. Quote, "We consider it an exclusive privilege for one portion of the community to have the means of education in colleges, while another is restricted to common schools, or perhaps by extreme poverty, even deprived of the limited education to be acquired in those establishments. Our voice, therefore, shall be raised in favor of a system of education which shall be equally open to all, as in a real republic it should be." Finally, the resolutions told what the Working Men's Party thought of the bankers and the banking system. The bankers were denounced as, quote, "the greatest knaves, impostors, and paupers of the age," unquote. They didn't mince words. The resolutions went on, quote, "As banking is now conducted, the owners of the banks receive annually of the people of the state not less than $2 millions in their paper money, and it might as well be pewter money, for which there is and can be nothing provided for its redemption on demand," unquote. The mockery that went up from all that was held influential, respectable, and stable when these resolutions were printed was echoed far and wide. They were looked upon first as a joke, and then, when the Working Men's Party began to reveal its earnestness and strength, as an insolent challenge to constituted authority, to wealth and superiority, and as a menace to society. Radicalism versus respectability. The Courier and Inquirer, owned by Webb and Noah, in the pay of the United States Bank, burst out into savage invective. It held the Working Men's Party up to opprobrium as an infidel crowd, hostile to the morals and the institutions of society and to the rights of property. They had elitist media control even way back then, in the early 1800s. Nevertheless, the Working Men's Party proceeded with an enthusiastic, almost ecstatic campaign and polled 6,000 votes, a very considerable number compared to the whole number of voters at the time. By 1831, however, it had gone out of existence. The reason was that it allowed itself to be betrayed by the supineness, incompetence, and, as some said, the treachery of its leaders. Sounds like the 9/11 Truth movement. Sounds exactly like it. Who were content to accept from a legislature controlled by the propertied interests various mollifying sops, which slightly altered certain laws, but which in no great degree redounded to the benefit of the working class. For a few bits of counterfeit, this splendid proletarian uprising, glowing with energy, enthusiasm, and hope, allowed itself to be snuffed out of existence. Come, Jesus, come. What a tragedy was there, and how futile and tragic must inevitably be the fate of any similar movement which depends not upon itself, not upon its own intrinsic collective strength and wisdom, but upon the say-so of leaders who come forward to assume leadership. Sounds like Jim Fetzer and the 9/11 bogus scholars who assumed the leadership of the 9/11 Truth movement, self-proclaimed leaders, who were in actuality moles, placed there, probably by the oligarchs, to deliberately sabotage a movement which would otherwise have been threatening to the oligarchs. Okay, back to the book. Representing only their own timidity of thought and cowardice of action, sounds like Jim Fetzer, they often end by betraying the cause placed confidingly in their charge. Sounds like Jim Fetzer et al. That class which for these immemorial generations has done the world's work, and as long has been plundered and oppressed and betrayed, thus had occasioned to learn anew the bitter lesson taught by the wreckage of the past, that it is from itself that the emancipation must come, that it is itself which must essentially think, act, and strike, that its forces, long torn asunder and dispersed, must be marshaled in invulnerable compactness and iron discipline, and so that its hosts may not again be routed by strategy, no man or set of men should be entrusted with the irrevocable power of executing its decrees. For too often has the courage, boldness, and strength of the many been shackled or destroyed by the compromising weakness of the leaders. The Panic of 1837. Passing over the Equal Rights Movement in 1834, which was a diluted revival of the Working Men's Party, and which also was turned into sterility by the treachery of its leaders. Wow! So the strategy the elitists used to subvert, to infiltrate and derail the 9/11 Truth Movement was a very old strategy indeed. We arrive now at the Panic of 1837, the time when Astor, profiting from misfortune on every side, vastly increased his wealth. The Panic of 1837 was one of those periodic financial and industrial convulsions resulting from the chaos of capitalist administration. Yeah, no sooner had it commenced than the banks refused to pay out any money other than their worthless notes. Oh, history just repeats. I wonder what Gustavus Myers had to say about the 1929 deliberately managed panic. For 33 years, they had not only enjoyed immense privileges, but they had used the powers of government to ensure themselves a monopoly of the business of manufacturing money. Yep. In 1804, the legislature of New York State had passed an extraordinary law called the Restraining Act. This prohibited, under severe penalties, all associations and individuals not only from issuing notes, but, quote, from receiving deposits, making discounts, or transacting any other business which incorporated banks may or do transact, unquote. Thus the law not only legitimized the manufacture of worthless money, but guaranteed a few banks a monopoly of that manufacture. Another restraining act was passed in 1818. The banks were invested with the sovereign privilege of depreciating the currency at their discretion and were authorized to levy an annual tax upon the country nearly equivalent to the interest of $200 million of deposits and circulation. On top of these acts, the legislature passed various acts compelling the public authorities in New York City to deposit public money with the Manhattan Company. This company, although as we have seen, expressly chartered to supply pure water to the city of New York, utterly failed to do so. At one stage, the city tried to have its charter revoked on the ground of failure to carry out its chartered function, but the courts decided in the company's favor, of course. At the outbreak of the Panic of 1837, the New York banks held more than $5,500,000 of public money. When called upon to pay only about $1 million of that sum, or the premium on it, they refused. But far worse was the experience of the general public. When they frantically besieged the banks for their money, the bank officials filled the banks with heavily armed guards and plug uglies with orders to fire on the crowd in case a rush was attempted. In every state, conditions were the same. In May 1837, not less than 800 banks in the United States suspended payment, refusing a single dollar to the government, whose deposits of $30 million they held, and to the people in general, who held $120 million of their notes. No specie whatever was in circulation. The country was deluged with small notes, colloquially termed shin plasters, of every form and every denomination, from the alleged value of 5 cents to that of $5. They were issued by every business individual or corporation for the purpose of paying them off as wages to their employees. The worker was forced to take them for his labor or starve. Moreover, the shin plasters were so badly printed that it was not hard to counterfeit them. The counterfeiting of them quickly became a regular business. Immense quantities of the stuff were issued. The worker never knew whether the bills paid him for his work were genuine or counterfeit, although essentially there was not any great difference in basic value between the two. Oh, wow. Well, I'm sorry. How sad. Oh, how sad. This country has been a fraud all along. The resulting widespread destitution. Now the storm broke. Everywhere was impoverishment, ruination, and beggary. Every bank official in New York City was subject to arrest for the most serious frauds and other crimes. But the authorities took no action. Oh, man. On the contrary, so complete was the dominance of the banks over government that they hurriedly got the legislature to pass an act practically authorizing a suspension of specie payments. The consequences were appalling. Quote, thousands of manufacturing, mercantile, and other useful establishments in the United States, unquote, reported a New York Senate committee, quote, have been broken down or paralyzed by the existing crisis. In all our great cities, numerous individuals who, by a long course of regular business, had acquired a competency, have suddenly been reduced, with their families, to beggary, unquote. Boy, was the Mosaic Code of Economics superior to our Fabian socialist Keynesian Marxist economic system. New York City was filled with the homeless and unemployed. In the early part of 1838, 1/3 of all the persons in New York City who subsisted by manual labor were wholly or substantially without employment. Not less than 10,000 persons were in utter poverty and had no other means of surviving the winter than those afforded by the charity of neighbors. The almshouses and other public and charitable institutions overflowed with inmates, and 10,000 sufferers were still uncared for. The prevailing system, as was pointed out even by the conventional and futile reports of legislative committees, was one inevitably calculated to fill the country with beggars, vagrants, and criminals. This important fact was recognized, although in a remote way, by de Beaumont and de Tocqueville, who, however, had no fundamental understanding of the deep causes, nor even of the meaning of the facts which they so accurately gathered. In their elaborate work on the penitentiary system in the United States, published in 1833, they set forth that it was their conclusion that in the 4 states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, the prison system, of which they had fully investigated, almost all those committed for crimes from 1800 to 1830 were convicted for offenses against property. In these 4 states collectively, with a population amounting to 1/3 of the Union, not less than 91.29 out of every 100 convictions were for crimes against property, while only 8.66 of every 100 were for crimes against persons. Wow! The Mosaic Code is looking better all the time, especially when you consider that there is no jails. There's no imprisoning grown men, human beings, in the Lord's law. There's just making restitution. If you screw up, if you damage somebody's property, you pay for it. And you move on. You keep being productive in your life. There's no prison industry system based upon the speculations of credit, of fiat money, like we have today in our Babylonian economic system. In New York State singly, 93.56 of every 100 convictions were for crimes against property and only 6.26 for crimes against persons. You think the cops are out to protect you? The cops have never been out to protect you. They've always been there to protect the property of the super rich. Property and crime. Thus we see from these figures filled with such tragic eloquence the economic impulse working at bottom and the property system corrupting every form of society. But here a vast difference is to be noted. Just as in England, the aristocracy for centuries had made the laws and had enforced the doctrine that it was they who should wield the power of the police of the state. So, in the United States, to which the English system of jurisprudence had been transplanted, the propertied interests constituting the aristocracy made and executed the laws. De Beaumont and de Tocqueville passingly observed that while the magistrates in the United States were plebeian, yet they followed out the old English system. In other words, the judges enforced laws which were made for and by the American aristocracy, i.e., the trading classes. The views, aims, and interests of these classes were so thoroughly entrenched in law that the fact did not escape the keen notice of these foreign investigators. Quote, "The Americans, descendants of the English," they wrote, quote, "have provided in every respect for the rich and hardly at all for the poor. In the same country where the complainant is put in prison, the thief remains at liberty if he can find bail. Murder is the only crime whose authors are not protected. The mass of lawyers see in this nothing contrary to their ideas of justice and injustice, nor even to their democratic institutions," unquote. And Jesus wished woe upon the lawyers, didn't he? The system and how it worked. The system then frequently forced the destitute into theft or mendicancy. What resulted? Laws, inconceivably harsh and brutal, enacted by and in behalf of property rights, were enforced with a rigor which seems unbelievable were it not for the fact that it is verified by the records of thousands of cases. Those convicted for robbery usually received a life sentence. They were considered lucky if they got off with 5 years. The ordinary sentence for burglary was the same with variations. Forgery and grand larceny were punishable with long terms ranging from 5 to 7 years. These were the laws in practically all of the states, with slight differences, but they applied to whites only. The Negro slave criminal had a superior standing in law, for the simple reason that while the whites were quote-unquote free labor, Negroes were property, and, of course, it did not pay to send slaves to prison. In Maryland, and in most southern states, where the slaveholders were both makers and executors of laws, the slaves need have no fear of prison. Quote, the slaves, as we have seen before, are not subject to the penal code of the whites. They are hardly ever sent to prison. Slaves who commit grave crimes are hung. Those who commit heinous crimes are not punishable with death, but are sold out of the state. In selling him, care is taken that his character and former life are not known, because it would lessen his price, unquote. Thus wrote de Beaumont and de Tocqueville, and in so writing, they handed down a fine insight into the methods of that southern propertied class which assumed so exalted an opinion of its own, quote, honor and chivalry, unquote. But the sentencing of the criminal was merely the beginning of a weird life of horror. It was customary at that period to immure prisoners in solitary confinement. There, in their small and reeking cells, filled with damps and pestilential odors, they were confined day after day, year after year, condemned to perpetual inactivity and silence. How contrary to Scripture! If they presumed to speak, they were brutally lashed with the whip, and morons, even moron Christians, say that America is or even was a Christian nation. Never. You had a couple of small Christian groups like the Pilgrims and the Moravians who meant well and started out well converting the Indians, but they were quickly overwhelmed and extinguished by the scumbags and the oligarchs from the old world and the Freemasons and all your other secret societies and aristocrats that turned this nation into the same thing the old world was. A feudalistic society where instead of converting the Indians, they soon set about genociding them. We never followed God's law virtually at all in this country. We had debtors' prisons, just the same as the old world had. We got them today. If the prisoners presumed to speak, they were brutally lashed with the whip. If they were not allowed to write letters, nor to communicate with any member of their family. Again, prisons are, there's no such thing as prisons in God's law. But the law condescended to allow a minister to visit them. I bet it was a corporate government-worshipping minister, to visit them periodically in order to awaken their religious thoughts and preach to them how bad a thing it was to steal. What a scum. They were 501c3 sellout pastors even then. They just didn't have the number, the acronym in front of them, the government law number. Many were driven stark mad or died of disease. Others dashed their brains out, while others, when finally released, went out into the world filled with an overpowering hatred of society and all its institutions, and a long-cherished thirst for revenge against it for having thus so cruelly misused them. Again, that's why there are no prisons in God's plan for us. only in the Babylonian system of laws, which we prefer. We, as fallen, sinful humans, prefer. Such were the laws made by the propertied classes, but they were not all. When a convict was released, the law allowed him only $3 to be given him to start anew with. John W. Edmonds, president of the New York Board of Prison Inspectors in 1844, wrote that, quote, "To starve or steal is too often the only alternative for them," unquote. If the released convict did steal, he was nearly always sent back to prison for life. Same thing as today. Nothing changes, nothing new under the sun. Equally severe in their way were the laws applying to mendicants and vagrants. 6 months or a year in the penitentiary or workhouse was the usual sentence. After the Panic of 1837, crime, mendicancy, vagrancy, and prostitution tremendously increased, as they always do increase after two events. War, which, when over, turns into civil life a large number of men who cannot get work, and panics, which chaotically uproot industrial conditions and bring about widespread destitutions. Although undeniably great frauds have been committed by the banking class, not a single one of that class went to jail. Come, Jesus, come, fix this sorry world. But large numbers of persons convicted of crimes against property and great batches of vagrants were dispatched there, and also many girls and women who had been hurled by the iron force of circumstances into the horrible business of prostitution. These were some of the conditions in those years. Let it not, however, be supposed that the traders, bankers, and landowners were impervious to their own brand of sensibilities. They dressed fastidiously, went to church, uttered hallelujahs, gave dainty receptions, formed associations to dole out alms, and kept up their prices and rents. The Bible calls that hypocrisy, of course. Notwithstanding the general distress, rents in New York City were greater than were paid in any other city or village upon the globe. All right, that was Chapter 4 of Volume 2 of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, written in the early 1900s. He was a muckraking journalist whose works have largely disappeared, unlike some other muckrakers like Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, although even her work is largely unknown, unreported today. But I don't think it's a coincidence. Because Gustavus Myers is writing about a lot of things that common folks are not supposed to know about. You know, like the real history of America. The fact that America was never a Christian nation. It was always a fraud. And in closing, folks, we'll do the next chapter next time. Get to chapter 5. But again, I want to reiterate. I read to you secular history in part to teach myself. I'll confess that selfish notion, because you always learn best what you teach. But I'm thinking maybe some of you, a few of you out there, who are able to profit from this audio book. That's what this is. Why I read this to you? For your benefit. It's to make it easier for you to stop trusting in human institutions, like elections, like voting, that all the fraud, like your government, like your senator, your governor, they're all frauds, folks. They always were. They always were. The human being next to you is just about as likely to stab you in the back as he is to shake your hand. Is there beauty in human beings? Yes. From my personal experience, it's a constant struggle within every human being, that good versus evil struggle. We're a mixture of evil and good. And so there is beauty and loyalty in this world, but since this is a fallen world, and we're imbued with that half admixture now, every one of us, we've got half evil in us in our natural state, more or less. This is a fallen world that you can never, ever, ever trust any human institution. I think that Scripture is very explicit about that, and I think that very nearly every Christian in America hasn't picked up on that, because Christians vote. They partake in that great fraud, giving their own imprimatur to their own slavery, to this Babylonian fraudulent system. They think that a president who is nothing more than a CEO for the corporate charter of the Bank of England, that's all America is. They think that a new president's going to fix things. We're so blinded, so fooled. None of that matters. It's all fraud, folks. Our politicians don't do anything. They're figureheads. The real power is behind the scenes. It always was. And it's all based in fraud. As Jesus said, He wished woe upon the lawyers and the scribes and the Pharisees. And really, those are the types of people who really... it's that ilk of people who really run the show today, even though some of them are not scribes or Pharisees anymore. Many of them are. Many of them, boy, the lawyers have their hands in this. Anyway, I hope that explains it. The more you learn about the constant, the unyielding fraud, the more than chronic fraud, the always rife fraud within human history, the more you find that out, and it's through all of recorded human history, the more you can just let it go and trust Jesus Christ to come back and fix it all. We can't fix it all. You can save your fellow man, and that's it. So get to work on that, and stop giving any consideration to your government. Your government ought to be persecuting you. It ought to be after you. If it's not after you, there's something wrong with you, with your faith. I know that flies in the face of the sellout, government-worshipping corporate pastors in America, but those are the ones who they're going to have a really big wake-up call, I think, on Judgment Day, because they've sold out to the enemy. I've been round and round on that in that subject. So, all right, I'm stopping it here. So, thanks for listening. This has been the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. God bless you.